Chapter 10, Section 1, Battling Segregation. Building background. After World War II, black soldiers who had risked their lives to serve their country came home to face racial discrimination. Such treatment angered many blacks. "I paid my dues over there," said veteran James Hicks, "and I'm not going to take this any more over here." Many black veterans joined with other African Americans to push harder for equality. Their efforts helped launch a civil rights movement that soon swept the nation. Civil rights in the post-war period. The push for black civil rights in the United States gained new momentum after World War II. As black veterans came home, many of them were no longer willing to put up with discrimination. They and other African Americans began to call for an end to racial inequality. The result was a number of key gains for African Americans. As you have read, in 1948, President Harry S. Truman desegregated the armed forces. That same year, Truman also banned discrimination in the hiring of federal employees. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, elected in 1952, took further steps to reduce racial discrimination in hiring practices. Meanwhile, at the state level, several northern and western states passed laws banning racial discrimination in public housing. Despite these gains, many opportunities remained closed to African Americans in the 1950s. Although this period was a time of economic prosperity for many white Americans, few black Americans shared in this new wealth. Furthermore, white resistance to black equality remained strong. Such opposition was particularly evident in the South, where white citizens continued to use unfair laws, fear, and violence to try to keep black citizens from voting or from standing up for their rights. One major barrier to equality for blacks was segregation. Custom and laws continued to separate black and white Americans in schools, housing, and jobs. Segregation was most rigid in the South, where Jim Crow laws forced blacks to use colored-only waiting rooms, restaurants, and other facilities. The 1896 Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson had established the separate but equal doctrine legalizing segregation. Separate black and white facilities were rarely equal, however. One glaring example of this inequality was the nation's black schools. A new generation of black leaders thus turned their attention to fighting segregation in education. School desegregation. In most cases, the separate schools for black students were far inferior to the schools for white students. One reason was that states often spent far less on students in black schools than those in white schools. For example, in 1940, southern states spent less than $17 per black student and more than $40 per white student. Because of this limited funding, black schools often had out-of-date textbooks, old and inadequate buildings, and fewer extracurricular programs. Such inequalities had far-reaching effects on black children's later opportunities and success in life. Fighting segregation. Civil rights activists had long been fighting school segregation. In the 1840s, Robert Morris, one of the nation's first black attorneys, and Charles Sumner, a white lawyer, sued the city of Boston. The lawsuit claimed that Boston's segregated schools violated the state constitution. The men lost the case, but it established an important principle that later activists would use, that segregated schools are inherently unequal. In the late 1930s, Charles Hamilton Houston, head of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, launched a campaign against segregation. Houston developed a strategy to chip away at the separate but equal doctrine, particularly in education. He hired Thurgood Marshall, a brilliant young black lawyer, to lead the team as the NAACP's chief legal counsel. Under Houston and Marshall, NAACP lawyers won a series of court cases challenging the separate but equal doctrine. One victory was against the University of Missouri. The university had refused to admit Lloyd Gaines, a black student, to its law school because of his race. The university instead offered to help pay for Gaines to go to an out-of-state law school. In the 1938 case, Gaines v. Canada, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that states had to provide equal educational facilities within their borders. Thus, each state had to provide separate black schools, including law schools, or admit black students to its white schools. The victory was a major step forward toward ending segregation in higher education. Instead of integrating its law school, the University of Missouri created a black law school in St. Louis. Gaines never had the chance to attend the school, however. On March 19, 1939, he disappeared in Chicago, Illinois. He was presumed murdered, and the case remains unsolved. In 1946, Marshall and the NAACP represented Heman Sweat, another black student denied access to a law school. The school in this case was the University of Texas. A lower court had ruled that unless the state of Texas established a separate but equal law school for black students, the university would have to admit Sweat. To meet the requirement, the University of Texas created a black law school in the basement of a house. This makeshift law school did not even come close to being equal to the university's prestigious all-white law school. The NAACP appealed, and in 1950, Marshall argued the case before the U.S. Supreme Court. In Sweat v. Painter, the court ruled that the University of Texas Black Law School was inferior to its white law school. Furthermore, the court ruled that separate law schools hurt the education of black law students. This major victory forced the nation's graduate and professional schools to integrate. That same year, the NAACP took on another school segregation case. George McLaurin, a black student, had been admitted to the University of Oklahoma graduate program. However, the university had forced McLaurin to sit apart from white students in classrooms, the library, and the cafeteria. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in McLaurin v. Oklahoma State Regents that these restrictions were unconstitutional. These legal victories helped break down segregation in higher education. Yet the nation's public elementary and secondary schools remain segregated and very unequal. The NAACP decided to push for the integration of all public schools. Brown v. Board of Education. In 1954, Thurgood Marshall argued a case before the U.S. Supreme Court that forever changed education in the United States. The case was actually a combination of court cases challenging the constitutionality of segregated public schools. The Supreme Court combined the cases under the name of one of them, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. In that case, NAACP members in Topeka tried to enroll their children, including Linda Brown, in white neighborhood schools. The schools refused to admit the black students, who had to attend black schools farther away. The Supreme Court heard arguments in the case over a 2-year period. In his arguments, Thurgood Marshall provided research suggesting that segregation harmed the self-image of young black students. The research helped influence the court's final decision. In 1954, in Brown v. Board of Education, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously ruled that the separate but equal doctrine in the nation's public schools was unconstitutional and therefore that racial segregation in public schools was illegal. Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote the landmark decision in the Brown case. It is doubtful that any child may reasonably be expected to succeed in life if he is denied the opportunity of an education. Such an opportunity, where the state has undertaken to provide it, is a right which must be made available to all on equal terms. Does segregation of children in public schools solely on the basis of race deprive the children of minority group of equal educational opportunities? We believe that it does. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Chief Justice Earl Warren, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, May 17, 1954. Crisis in Little Rock. At the time of the Brown decision, 21 states had laws segregating public schools. Reaction to school integration in these states was mixed. Many black leaders praised the Brown decision, and a few white leaders agreed to start desegregating, or integrating, public schools. However, other white leaders strongly opposed school integration, and some even vowed to defy it. For example, in Virginia, several white officials pledged to join forces to block school integration at all levels. The Virginia legislature did its part by passing laws forcing the closure of any schools that integrated and by helping white students attend all-white private schools. School segregation in the South moved slowly, and only 3 southern school districts had desegregated by the end of 1954. In 1955, the U.S. Supreme Court strengthened the Brown ruling by ordering public schools to desegregate with all deliberate speed. Enforcing the order proved difficult, however. Demonstrations against integration took place in many parts of the South, and some white citizens even burned crosses in protest. In the end, a crisis in Little Rock, Arkansas, compelled President Eisenhower and the federal government to take action. As in many other parts of the South, in Little Rock, the school board adopted a plan to desegregate its public schools gradually, one at a time. In the fall of 1957, the board allowed 9 outstanding black students to attend the city's white Central High School. These students became known as the Little Rock Nine. Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus, in violation of a federal court order, called out the Arkansas National Guard to keep the 9 students from entering the white high school. Faubus claimed that this action was necessary to protect the school from white extremists who had threatened violence. On September 4, 1957, the first day of school, some local ministers brought 8 of the 9 black students to Central High School. An angry white crowd confronted the students. At the school door, the National Guard barred the way and refused to let the students enter. The 9th black student, 15-year-old Elizabeth Eckford, had not received a message about where to meet the other students. Arriving at the school alone, Eckford was surrounded by a hostile white crowd as she made her way toward the building. When the National Guard turned her away, someone in the crowd began yelling, "Lynch her! Lynch her!" As Eckford struggled to escape, a white woman came forward and helped her safely leave. For nearly 3 weeks, members of the Arkansas National Guard prevented the Little Rock Nine from entering Central High School. The tense situation continued until President Eisenhower sent more than 1,000 federal troops to Little Rock to end the standoff. On September 25, 1957, U.S. soldiers with fixed bayonets escorted the 9 black students into Central High School. Once in school, the black students endured frequent abuse. White students called them names and kicked and shoved them in the halls. The students even received death threats and had to be assigned guards for protection. Despite such difficulties, 8 of the 9 students remained at Central High, and in May 1958, Ernest Green became the school's first black graduate. Green recalled that none of his classmates clapped when his name was called. "But I figured they didn't have to," he said. "I had accomplished what I came there for." The Little Rock crisis revealed just how strong racism was in some areas, and school desegregation continued for decades. Other calls for change. In addition to fighting segregation in schools, African Americans battled segregation in other areas of society. One of these areas was Major League Baseball. In the late 1940s, the NAACP took on this challenge with the help of a highly talented athlete. Breaking the color line in professional baseball. In the early years of professional baseball, African Americans had played on major league teams. In the 1880s, however, major league teams began refusing to sign black players. Talented black ball players had few opportunities to play professionally until the 1920s, when the Negro League formed. In the early 1940s, black civil rights activists began working to end segregation in Major League Baseball. The breakthrough came when Branch Rickey, owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers, agreed to sign a black ball player. Rickey knew he needed not only a star black player, but also one who could withstand the insults he would surely face. He chose Jackie Robinson, a gifted athlete who had lettered in 4 sports in college. On April 15, 1947, Robinson broke the color line in Major League Baseball when he played his first game with the Brooklyn Dodgers. The decision to sign Jackie Robinson was a phenomenal success for the Brooklyn Dodgers. In his first year on the team, Robinson won the National League's Rookie of the Year award. An amazing ball player, he went on to become the National League's most valuable player in 1949. Rickey had asked Robinson not to talk or fight back when people shouted insults at him. Robinson agreed, and his dignity, combined with his immense talent, earned him the admiration of millions of fans. He retired in 1956, and in 1962 became the first African American named to the Baseball Hall of Fame. The murder of Emmett Till. Despite early victories against segregation, blacks remained second-class citizens to many white Americans, particularly in the South. This truth gained nationwide attention in 1955 with the murder of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy from Chicago, Illinois. Till had gone to Mississippi to visit his great-uncle. Having grown up in the North, the black teenager did not understand the South's strict racial etiquette. Soon after arriving in Mississippi, Till and some other black teenagers went to a small grocery owned by a young couple, Roy and Carolyn Bryant. Roy was not in the store at the time. Egged on by his comrades, Till made a comment to Carolyn Bryant. She later claimed he asked her for a date and whistled at her, but historians do not know for certain. Whatever Till said, she took offense. Although she did not tell her husband, he soon found out about the incident. 4 days later, Roy Bryant and his half-brother J.W. Milam kidnapped Till in the middle of the night. They brutally beat and shot him and then tossed his body in the Tallahatchie River. National reports of Till's murder deeply moved many Americans. His mother had done a bold thing. She refused to let him be buried until thousands marched past his open casket in Chicago and looked down at his mutilated body. I felt a deep kinship to him. I couldn't get Emmett out of my mind. Muhammad Ali, boxer. Bryant and Milam stood trial for the crime, but a jury of 12 white men found them not guilty. Months later, the 2 men confessed to the killing of a reporter for Look magazine. Till's senseless murder and his killer's acquittal awakened more Americans to the racism that Southern blacks faced and to the need for action.